Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Anya Kamenetz and Sarah Karp. Thanks for joining us. FAN celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We're committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Anya Kamenetz speaks, writes, and thinks about generational justice and how children learn, grow, and thrive on a changing planet. She covered education as a journalist for many years, including for NPR, where she also co-created the podcast Life Kit Parenting in partnership with Sesame Workshop. She is currently an advisor to the Aspen Institute on a new initiative to end climate silence in children's media. In addition to The Stolen Year, Anya is the author of several acclaimed nonfiction books, Generation Debt, DIYU, Edupunks, Edupreneurs, and the Coming Transformation of Higher Education, The Test, Why Our Schools Are Obsessed with Standardized Testing, but You Don't Have to Be, and The Art of Screen Time, How Your Family Can Balance Digital Media and Real Life. Sarah Karp is a reporter focused on education, children, and families at NPR affiliate WBEZ. A former reporter for Catalyst Chicago, the Chicago Reporter, and the Daily Southtown, Sarah has covered education and children and family issues for more than 20 years. She has won 5 Education Writers Association Awards, 3 Society of Professional Journalism Awards, and the 2005 Sidney Hillman Award. And now let's welcome Anya Kamenetz and Sarah Karp.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. That was an awesome introduction. I am so grateful to be back with Family Action Network for my 3rd event. It is such a remarkable and unique speaker series, and the people that come to speak to this audience all year round are so amazing, and I'm always so honored and a little bit abashed to be among them. So thanks again for having me, and really excited. Thanks for everyone joining me tonight. I'm going to speak for a little while with slides, and then Sarah and I, who were both in our separate trenches covering the pandemic, and schools, will have some stuff to talk about that I'm sure will be quite interesting. So let me get started sharing my screen. So my book is called The Stolen Year. Some people like to point out on Twitter that it was not just 1 year. This is true. However, when I started the book, we didn't know how long it was going to be. So here we are. I'm starting this with a little bit of a check-in, and everybody knows the adage that you should put your oxygen mask on first. And one of the things that I've learned during the pandemic, both as a reporter and as a parent, is that children don't thrive if they're not in a matrix of thriving, supported adults. So what I'd like to do is start by a quick check-in think to yourself, if you'd like to put it in the chat, you can. Where are you on the bell curve? Are you still struggling? Are you in the middle languishing, or are you thriving? And we'll have some examples of this. Also, the question equally applies to your children. Are your children right now struggling, languishing, or thriving? I know, because I've been all over the country talking about this book, that there are people in every room that are in every part of this spectrum, and sometimes all in one day. Some of the things that struggling looks like, of course, it looks like diagnosable clinical conditions, anxiety, depression, ADHD, self-harming substances like food and screens that help us dissociate. It looks like burnout, really not being able to do the work, and parental burnout is also a thing. It looks like moral injury and vicarious trauma, which are when bad things are happening not to us, but to other people, and we can't do anything about it. And moral injury is where you're embedded within a system, let's say as a teacher or as a childcare worker or even as a parent, where the system isn't working and it's forcing you to do things that you don't want to do, or you cannot be effective in your work. That causes moral injury. Vicarious trauma is a trauma that happens to people around us, which many of us experienced during the pandemic. And it is very, very real. We can experience PTSD from trauma that happens to other people. It happens to journalists, and it happens to care providers, caregivers of all kinds. Languishing is the term that was given to us by Adam Grant, a writer kind of talking about it's subclinical. You're in the middle here. You wake up in the morning and just kind of sigh and stare at the ceiling. There's a sense of joylessness, low energy, poor concentration, wondering, is this all there is? Are we always going to feel this way? And then special to this moment, people who are in a schooling environment or educators may have heard the term restraint collapse. It usually means what happens when a child is a perfect angel all day in school and then they come home and they completely become a puddle of mud and they're yelling and screaming and crying. And because they can't be restrained anymore and they let it go in a safe space. I'm adopting it to mean where we are in this point in the pandemic, where I see a lot of people who held it together for a long time, finally falling apart. I see it with kids, I see it with adults, that we couldn't when we were under so much pressure. We had to be strong, we had to keep it together. Now that things are a little bit more normal, we're dissolving, or we can't handle the pressure that we used to be able to handle. Also want to acknowledge that there are people here who are thriving. We have rediscovered our sense of purpose. We are maintaining healthy habits, strengthening our relationships. We have energy, we're getting things done, and want to make sure that that's our North Star. We're going to try to get our kids back to that sense of thriving. We have to do it. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight. So let's take a moment. Think about where you are. Think about where you would like to be. Think about where your kids are and where you'd like them to be. So what happened to us? Where are we now? And what's next when it comes to kids and the pandemic and our response to the pandemic, of course. My overview of what happened starts with this graph. It's a little bit hard to read, but what it shows is the distribution of school closures by region and by population. The blue countries are low and middle income countries, and the size of the bubble is the size of population, and the x-axis is the number of days. So we can see that the United States kept its schools closed longer for more students than any other rich nation, with the exception of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. This was an outlier. We were outliers in how we responded to the pandemic when it came to children's normalcy, and there are a lot of reasons why. Some of the quotes from my book that kind of capture what happened to kids because of this. This is a girl named E, who I interviewed at the age of 15. It just is really sad to see the best years of your life like go down the tubes. We see that there's been impacts on children's health all over the world. They didn't get access to basic medical care. In the United States, there has been an uptick in diabetes and children's weight, as well as missing basic vaccinations, not even talking about COVID vaccinations. There has been, this is a previous declaration, there's been a re-up of this declaration of a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health. And the original statement says, this worsening crisis in child and adolescent mental health is inextricably tied to the stress brought on by COVID-19, as well as, they say, the ongoing struggle for racial justice. So acceleration of previous trends during the pandemic because of social isolation, loss of meaning, sometimes material deprivation, lack of access to school and the routines there. A mother that I interviewed very early on in the pandemic, her middle child, they were both teachers, both parents were teachers, dealing with a whole school full of depressed teenagers that they were teaching. And then they had 3 kids at home that they were homeschooling, and their middle child stopped eating because of the pressure. He developed a stress-induced eating disorder. He was just lying in bed, my baby, saying he would just rather die. She got help, they got help, and they recovered. But it was a very harrowing time early in the pandemic. Honest opinion from Jonah in San Francisco, Zoom just sucks. And of course, we see that there's been academic impacts. And we cannot talk about the impact of the pandemic on children without talking about the people who lost loved ones, right? The current estimates are that the United States and America, 213,000 children have lost one parent or even both parents. All over the world, there's about 10 million children who have lost one or both parents to the pandemic. And of course, this is a childhood experience that has lifetime consequences. just because we talk about school closures and we talk about the impact of school closures doesn't mean that we discount or downplay the fact that this was a lethal pandemic, that the United States lost more people per population than any other rich country, right? We have to be able to hold both of those facts together. And this is one of the children who lost a caregiver, their grandfather who lived with them, her and Giselle, and she said, we would spend a bunch of time together and we have all these memories, but you can't make more. So that's what children went through. They went through academic impacts, mental health impacts, social and emotional. They lost access to basic health, and sometimes they experienced traumas, adverse childhood experiences that they're going to carry through their lives. So where are we now? Our public schools are in trouble. Public school enrollment has dropped more than any other time since World War II, which is when teen boys left to enlist. And really the impact is even greater because we didn't have such a high percentage of people enrolled in public school in the first place, 75 years ago. This is a headline from Winston-Salem, North Carolina from last month. It says, looking for the children who didn't return to class. And in this small district, they're missing about 1,000 students. There's far more students missing around the world. I'm not as worried about the kids who transfer to private schools or charter schools or are homeschooled. We're worried about the kids who are not enrolled in school, and we don't really know how many they are. We also see that young children missed assessments. They missed intake qualifications. This is a very recent report from EdWeek. Young children were massively overlooked. There was a 40% drop in children being receiving special education services, young children in the beginning of the school system. And so obviously we know that cascades. So the impact on children in special education, which is 14% of all kids, is massively disproportionate when it comes to the pandemic. Many of those kids were not able to receive their services over Zoom. Many more had trouble receiving services when in a masked situation as well. So this is a problem because kids who have a special need, they actually regress. So there's been a lot of pushback on the notion of learning loss. Oh, kids don't really forget things. But when it comes to a skill that's acquired in a developmental delay situation, they do in fact forget things. They do in fact go backwards. So it's a very serious problem. Of course, we know that our test scores declined. If you heard my introduction, that I don't think test scores are the be all and end all. We have to look at attendance. We have to look at enrollment, persistence. Nevertheless, we have the first ever decline in mathematics, the largest drop in reading achievement since the 1980s. Again, oxygen mask. Mothers had a horrible pandemic. Primary caregivers had a very hard pandemic. They were forced to stop out of the workforce, not forced. Circumstances collided, such as when they were heterosexual partnerships, it was the woman, not the man, who stepped back and took the time and took the brunt of the extra work and the homeschooling. And this led to many adverse effects, including on mental health, including on drinking, on weight gain, and the economic downstream effects of this. We know that this was known as a she session. It was more women that lost jobs. It was more Latina women that lost jobs, more Black women that lost jobs. And many of them were breadwinners of their single parent households. So this is a massive setback, which with the economic, during the pandemic, there was extra money coming in for families. There was CARES Act, there was unemployment, and then there was child tax credit. All of that is gone now. Prices have gone up. Eviction moratoriums are over. And many families are feeling that crunch of child poverty, again, going back to where it was before the pandemic, before we unleash this flood of money onto families. Speaking of childcare, speaking of going back to work, we did not protect our childcare structure. We don't really have a childcare infrastructure in this country. We have a patchwork, and we didn't protect those nonprofits, those women who take children into their home. And all of the childcare problems that we had before the pandemic have been massively exacerbated by the fact that those small businesses and nonprofits have no way of matching the wages that are now being paid at Amazon, at Starbucks, even at the local gas station. So it's a childcare desert. It's a childcare disaster. We're never going to get our economy back on track if we don't provide for those caregivers. And if we don't provide for those caregivers, we're not providing for children, right? So 0 to 3, the time when your brain is growing faster than any other time in your life, those are the people who need to be taken care of by caregivers who are not stressed, who are able to have their basic needs met. And that's exactly what we're not doing for families right now, because we don't subsidize childcare in this country. A long-term impact of the pandemic is that community college enrollment plummeted in this country, down more than 20% total. This is a combination of the labor crunch. So there's a lot of, good jobs to be had. People don't see the immediate need to go to college. It's also a sign of many teenagers losing their way, drifting out of school and into paid work during the pandemic. We don't really know what is going to become of this. We've never dealt with this kind of crash in college enrollment, not during an economy when college was so important for people's futures. So this should be a matter of national concern. Everybody who has a business or is an employer should be thinking about, where are my skilled applicants going to come from if I don't have people in college right now that are going to graduate in a few years? What is our effort to get kids back into college or give them on-ramps back into college, especially if the economy, if wages start to come back down, if inflation comes back down, if we go into recession, what are those kids going to do? What's next? Where do we go from here? What does the recovery look like? I think I want to emphasize here simply that the recovery is going to take a very long time. We should not be surprised to see impacts from young children not getting special education services, from people not going into college on time, from mental health. All of this we're going to be dealing with for a decade. And so it's not a quick fix of any kind, and we can't afford to take our eyes off the ball, not just as parents, but also as citizens, as we think about where we go from here. And just quickly, as I think about recovery and repair, and I've been talking about this again all over the country, we hear so much about resilience, and I fear that the word resilience breeds complacency. And I would like for us to as well think about, first of all, what it takes to foster resilience. It doesn't come for free. It's not automatic. Secondly, what do we do if we're not resilient, right? If we can't just bounce back like nothing happened, where's the hope? Where do we go from here? So we need to foster resilience. We need ourselves and our children to have a chance to rest. We need them to be able to do the basic tasks that make them happy and joyful and peaceful. We need to talk about what happened, but in a controlled fashion. We can't obsess about what happened in the past. We also can't gloss over it. So it's troublesome to see that parents, when they're polled right now, they tend to say that their children are doing fine academically, and that's not the case on average. So there's probably a gap in how we're actually talking about how our kids are doing, and that needs a little bit more attention. And then also part of what fosters resilience is making plans for the future and thinking about what's next. Post-traumatic growth is different from resilience because in order to experience post-traumatic growth, you have to have been traumatized. So it doesn't just mean that you soldier on. It means that you acknowledge how you were damaged and what you lost. And post-traumatic growth has been clinically observed in people who went through all kinds of terrible experiences, losing a loved one, having a cancer diagnosis, even being a prisoner of war. And it's a mental inventory that people do when they say, I went through this tough experience and I found out who my real friends are. People showed up for me. I see who I am. I know what I'm really made of because I faced this challenge down. I'm grateful for life in a whole new way, and I have a whole new perspective. And I'm excited for what I can do now that I maybe wasn't even able to do before, or I was afraid to do before. So those are the aspects of post-traumatic growth that I think are important to think about, because we're never going to get to a place where it's like 2019 again and like all of these years didn't happen. But I believe that we can get to an honest place where we say, you know what? I'm proud of you, my children. I'm proud that you got through this. I'm proud of the qualities that you've developed because of what you got through. As long as we give the kids the resources that they need to recover, we can also say that there might be a silver lining here, or there's something good that can come out of this. And the way that we foster post-traumatic growth, again, this is clinically shown. This is from Richard Tedeschi, who coined the term post-traumatic growth and fosters post-traumatic growth. He said children, and especially teenagers, absolutely can experience post-traumatic growth as long as they're old enough to understand that an experience can be good and bad at the same time. Okay, that's about 7 or 8 years old, age of reason. Teenagers in particular, and I think emerging into puberty, thinking about starting to tell the story of their own lives, that's a very fertile time to experience post-traumatic growth. To foster it in others, first of all, we talk about what makes it possible. So we talk about the fact that our brains can recover and they can be better than they were before. That's education. Emotional literacy is giving our kids the toolbox to repair and be able to handle difficult emotions, because disclosure is talking about a difficult experience, and that's going to raise difficult emotions. Talking about what happened, talking about what we missed out on, talking about what we're sad about And then narrative development saying, I was here then, and I'm going to be here next. So this is my plan. This is how I'm going to recover. This is how I'm going to repair. This is how we're going to do it. It's not going to happen overnight. That's the story that we tell. That's narrative development. And then the final step in fostering post-traumatic growth is acts of service. So that's where you take the thing that happened to you and you use it to build your empathy and you use it to help other people. And I'm going to actually stop there and turn it over to Sarah so we can have a conversation.
Great. That was really, really informative and, really, really impressive work that you've done. I really appreciate that you've tried to put so many different things into one place. Cause I think for journalists, we're sort of like covering each bump along the road, but we're not really looking at it as like a full picture. And one of the things that I wanted to start by talking about is one thing that I've noticed covering Chicago public schools is that there's kind of a disconnect between the lip service and the reality. So there's like two things that are going on. One, we say we want to be sensitive to kids' emotional health. We want them to have, their well-being to be front and center, that we understand that they've been through trauma. But on the other hand, we say we need to accelerate learning. Mm-hmm. And, we want to push them to have like straight A's and for example, like the state of Illinois put 5 mental health days on the books for students, but then we could count those as absences and it will count that against the student in grades and things like that. And I'm just wondering how much you see that there's marriage between this idea that we really want to foster emotional well-being against kind of this push to accelerate learning.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great place to start. And thank you. And also thank you for your great coverage over the years. I've always seen WBZ as a standard bearer in this kind of stuff. So I really feel like that emerges from a false dichotomy between excellent teaching and supporting children's social and emotional well-being. I don't think that they should be at odds. And we know that good teaching emerges from relationships that are built, warm, empathetic, trust relationships between teachers and students. And that doesn't come from, a teacher isn't someone who never expects anything from you and always take things easy on you. That warmth and that empathy can be coupled with a sense of expectation and a sense of, I believe in you and I think that you can do better than this. Part of what we get from school emotionally is a sense of achievement, status, and being able to, and meaning. I mean, there's so many teenagers that I talked to at the beginning of the pandemic who said, when they took away remote school, I lost my sense of meaning and purpose because I'm invested in school. I'm invested in doing well in school. And they tried to make it easy on us. And that just made it seem like it was meaningless. So for me, I think the whole idea of a mental health day, it's a fine policy, but the idea that telling you to stay home from school is the best way to improve your mental health is a little bit of a mixed message. Like, how can we make school the place where kids go to repair their mental health and actually be engaged in their learning? And, one of the ways, and so that's not just pie in the sky, one of the ways to make that concrete is to say that an active learning classroom, right, where students are working in small groups, for example, and they are helping each other, is a classroom where there's better peer relationships and there's better learning at the same time. So I think it's possible to do both. I don't think we should let up on that. I don't think we should accept the false dichotomy.
Great. Along those lines, I'm wondering, you mentioned about special education and children who did not get assessed and missed services during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what you think about compensatory services and, just adding on more services or giving kids, let's say, extra time with the occupational therapist or the physical therapist or whatever they might need to make up for what's missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, compensatory services is in general what people ask for because it's the kind of redress that you can get. And sometimes it's exactly the right thing. I think it's not a bad framework actually when thinking about all the kids, not just the kids with an IEP or individualized education plan. What do we do to compensate them for what they lost? So I think it's a fine model. I think that you know, the as I delved more deeply into the special education world for this book and for the reporting for this book, I realized just how much energy is wasted by the fact that it's such an adversarial system. You know, it takes a parent, usually it's a mother, it can be a full-time job, just getting your kid through the system and getting them the services that they are entitled to by law. And so the whole thing is set up as adversarial. And it just strikes me that that is so ill-suited to the situation we find ourselves in right now, which is almost all the kids with special needs have extra stuff that they need to get in order to you know, but in fact, they're having to go one by one and figure out how ways to fix it. And the school districts sometimes expend so much energy fighting that, that, you know, they're not expending that energy on helping.
Yeah, I just read something today in Chalk Beach, Chicago, that only like 300 kids in the entire Chicago public school system, which, you know, last year we had about 320,000 kids, got compensatory services approved. And so that's like very, very small. And I mean, it's always been sort of the case that the parents who are more involved are the ones that get those services for their kids. But I think the pandemic, you know, just exacerbated that continual issue, right? That those are the kids that get kind of left behind.
I really see it as a problem, because we know from polling that, you know, parents are not, they're not that concerned right now about their kids' academic progress. They kind of feel like their kids are doing okay because they're comparing them to the other kids in the class, which is a totally normal thing to do. And maybe there's grade inflation, maybe there's other things going on, but I worry about it getting swept under the rug, because I see, like, for example, in New York City last summer, schools offered summer school and they offered tutoring, but they didn't really make the case to individual families, and there wasn't a lot of uptake. And then they shrug their shoulders and say, well, the parents don't really want it. And so I feel like there's a real disconnect there.
Yeah, the same exact thing happened in Chicago. We had everybody, they said everybody who wanted to go to summer school could go, and they actually would never give us, this is the summer of 2021, they never would give us the number of kids that went. And I'm assuming that's because so few kids went that they don't want to they don't want to admit how few kids went. Now this year, I will say that they changed it and they made it mainly enrichment programs, and a lot more kids went. And I thought that was really smart, because, you know, sort of the last thing that kids wanted to do last summer was sit in front of the computer for more time. So,
yeah.
You know, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about using computers and remote learning, and what you see as the good things from that could translate into schools, and what you see are the things that should not translate into schools. Or do you think that there should be no remote learning, or not remote learning, but less computerized, you know, learning in schools?
So you and I have engaged on this in the past, right? Because before the pandemic, there was such a thing as credit recovery. And credit recovery was a way for high school students to get some classes online and to get their degrees. And it helped the district because it helped students recover, you know, some learning that they may have failed a class the first time. Instead of having, you know, getting years behind, they could catch up. So, you know, the possibilities and the drawbacks of remote learning with K-12 kind of remain the same as they were before. The possibilities are, there are kids with questioning gender identities. There are kids with school anxiety, social anxiety. There are kids with ADHD that have a parent who's able to be in the room with them, keeping them on task. And these are all types of kids that really did better in remote. They did better not having to deal with a room full of all the stimulation, all of the hostility, whatever it is that's in a classroom full of kids. And so it actually was a better academic environment for them. And then there are all the kids who found it completely a waste of time, or they just couldn't pay attention or concentrate. How do you set things up such that remote learning is available as an option? And then you have kids who have legitimate other responsibilities in their lives. They might have their own child, right? And this tricky middle ground where they're now earning money during remote high school, they are now earning money that the family really needs, or they're taking care of younger siblings, which we don't want them to have that responsibility, but we can't always make that decision. We don't know what goes on in different families. So how do we make sure that remote learning is available to those kids and that they have the support that they need to get the most out of it, while not making it a default option for people who are like, well, I just don't want to get my kid to school in the morning, or, this kid has a mental health challenge that would best be served by integrating them back into the classroom, not helping them like hide from it. So it's very tricky. I mean, do you sit down and do a case-by-case evaluation? Do you do some kind of special monitoring? Is there some kind of accountability process? How do we allow that to happen? I think it's going to happen. And so the question now is like, what are the guardrails around it?
Yeah. And kind of along those lines, one thing that's happening in Chicago is that you talked about the kids that are missing, right? And so we also are down enrollment, from last year, about 8,000 students, but it's a continued trend. And they have this program, they're spending $18 million to try to engage some disengaged young people, right? I'm wondering, what you think the school district should do, because I don't know how successful they're being.
Mhm.
And part of the issue is that a lot of these kids are working and the academy is pretty good and they can make money. And so they need to work and their family depends. So I just think it's a very hard sell for these kids to come back.
I think that situation is crying out for expanded alternative high schools. Just give on-ramps, make it as easy as possible, make it so, I mean, there's a lot of different models of alternative high school, but a portfolio program where you can combine a part-time job with classes, and maybe there's night classes, maybe there's some online classes, but there's a connection to school and to teachers and to peers and sort of a path forward from there. I think ideally alternative high school programs have a college component as well, where they're on-ramping you into a technical program. So don't work fast food, work something that, I mean, maybe it is fast food, maybe it's retail, but there's something where there's a ladder to somewhere else, right? And just don't think that you're going to get them back into a traditional classroom, because we know that there's very high levels of disengagement in a traditional academic program in high school, particularly for kids who are, who academic achievement is not their main passion in life.
And, sort of following with that, one of the things that the official numbers haven't come out yet, but I think maybe next week at the Board of Ed meeting, they're going to talk about an increase in graduation. So while achievement's going down, disengagement's going up, more kids got a diploma. And some of the teachers that I've talked to are like, yeah, because they said if you basically you showed up one day in the last month of school, you might get to the point, like they made it very easy to get the diploma. And I think they did that the year before too. In 2021, it was, some of those stringent graduation requirements were kind of lax. I'm wondering what you think about that, because, on one hand, it's been a hard time. A lot of these kids had things out of their control. Why keep them in high school? On the other hand, if they do go to college, if they do go to the workforce, if there's needed skills that they don't have, that might not be that beneficial either.
I think it's a very tricky problem, because there is, I mean, you don't want that diploma to become a ticket to nowhere, and you don't want school systems to create the appearance of recovery where there actually has not been recovery. So I think, this is a big symptom of, the ways that schools have responded to the pressures of the pandemic and the scrutiny that they're under, and some of the vilification of the schools that has happened during the pandemic. And so, trying to manipulate different kinds of statistics. And you were saying, like, they won't tell us this number, they won't tell us that number. So there's a lack of transparency, and not really the kind of conversation that you'd like to have between a city and a school system about how we're all responding to this problem that we all went through, right? I guess my question would be with the diploma, with the graduation requirements. I mean, what's the follow-up? What's happening to those students? And are they able to find a footing? Maybe they're okay in this labor market, but where are they going to be in a year and 2 years? And what are the community colleges saying in your city, right? Are they getting those kids in, and are those kids able to succeed? because
They're not getting
ultimately,
the kids in the door. They're not getting the kids in the door. I mean, there's a very big drop off among the city colleges.
so where we go from here is we go to what they call in the global statistics NEET, not educated, not employed. And in the United States, we call them opportunity youth. So they're 18 to 24-year-olds that are not in work, not in school. And they go between low wage jobs, and it's a massive kind of undertow to any sense of recovery and renewal, let alone like the waste of human potential that represents, right? But it's also, it's something that's associated with crime and social unrest and just a general sense of high unemployment that drags on within a city. And so, yeah, I think this needs to be reconstructed. It can't just be about the schools getting rid of the kids. Like this is a whole city's problem. This is everybody's kids, and every institution in society. Employers need to be like, I mean, I talked to, superintendents in different cities where they are calling up small business owners and being like, you've got my kid is working the night shift. Like, I need him back in class. It's like, this is a problem. Like, if you're going to hire a 16-year-old, why is that 16-year-old not in school? If they're working clopening for you, like closing and then opening the next day, like what is that kid's well-being? And so how do we make this everybody's problem?
This is another question. Do you think that this moment could be a reckoning for higher education and maybe make some fundamental changes in it that could in the long run be positive? Because not that many kids are going to college. There's it's not just community colleges, it's 4-year universities, and part of that is that because kids don't see the relevance, partly because they can get jobs, but also partly because I think the pandemic shed new light on it. And I just wonder, like, what role do you think higher education plays, and does it need to change in response?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that it accelerated a reckoning that was already on its way. So demographically, both schools and colleges are dealing with a downturn in birth rates and a downturn in immigration. And particularly for colleges, because they depended a lot on not just immigration, but international students, especially the higher end, the more students they were getting from India, from China, from all around the world, right? So those kids, the door shut, the kids stopped coming, right, for a variety of reasons. And they might or might not come back. They can go to Canada. By the way, Canada has not had the downturn in college admissions that we have. Mm-hmm. This is a this side of the border problem, and I think that's kind of worth pointing out. I think we have seen higher ed trying to grapple with this, dropping, ACT and SAT requirements, right? There's a lot more talk about an interest in trade programs and certificates, not even 2-year degrees. So quicker paths to degree. Obviously, every single college now has an online program, so they have to think about where that fits into their overall mission. So yeah, I think it is a reckoning point. I mean, you can predict the demise of the traditional university all day long, and I myself have done it for over a decade, and it still hasn't come to pass. So, Clayton Christensen said half of all universities would be bankrupt in 15 years, and now he's dead, and that hasn't happened. So, like, they are very resilient institutions, but I do see a little bit of a hollowing out potentially happening. I see some of the weak ones kind of going to the side, and like other ones having to really reevaluate what it is that they do and the role that they play.
I wanted to ask about, the COVID relief money that schools got, and infused a bunch of money into schools. Yeah. And, and I've read this at other places across the country, and in Chicago, this is also true, where there's been a lot of investment in staff. A lot of schools are using this for staff positions and for tutors and social workers and counselors. And, in about 2 years, all that money has to be spent.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you think that the federal government is going to have to come up with something else to infuse into schools, because, from what you were saying, I mean, the problems aren't going to be gone. And if we just, at that point, lay off thousands of people and don't have those supports in schools, I think it could hurt kids or set them back.
I think you're right. I think that, so I guess on the optimistic side of the spectrum, I don't think any president has ever approved a budget that has a decrease in education funding, even though there have been presidents who tried to eliminate the Department of Education. It just doesn't turn out to be that popular when you go to actually try to cut stuff. So I could imagine, but this is not eliminating, this is sunsetting a program that was already always intended to be temporary. And the real problem is that, you know, public schools have lost students. They had a 2.6%, 2.7% drop in enrollment nationwide. And that was, you know, and we already talked about demographics, like the birth rate plummeted during the pandemic and it was already on the decline. So we're talking about 4 and 5-year-olds in 2024, 2025, like those are the kids that will not be showing up. So how do you keep headcount from an employer perspective in your schools if you don't have the students in the seats? And we know what that looks like because you look at school districts like Oakland and other places around the country where they lose students. Schools have to close. They have to combine with each other and people lose their neighborhood schools and that makes them even more upset and then even more students leave. And so I think this is going to take a lot of different paths around the country. In some places, vouchers are going to grow. Charter schools are going to grow. Homeschooling might grow as an alternative. And, private schools might grow at the expense of public schools and suburban districts might grow at the expense of urban districts. Overall, it seems like, there's a lot of momentum traveling in the same direction, which is in the direction of people leaving their public schools and public schools having fewer resources because of that.
Along sort of these lines, I wanted to ask how you think what's going on in education post the pandemic is going to impact the midterm elections. And even it's sort of that question, but also how do you think the pandemic, or do you think the pandemic in any way sort of set the stage for what we see now, which is sort of these sort of cultural wars within schools? I mean, do you think that there's a connection and how that's casting into the midterm elections?
I would love to hear what you think about that too. I mean, I think it seems that the political polarization over the response to the pandemic, the deliberate politicization of the response to the pandemic, first of all, by the Republicans, right, set us up for this situation where whether or not you followed health protocols became a heavily loaded political choice. And the decision of democratically led states and districts to prolong school closures outside of international health protocols built up a lot of resentment. There's a lot of resentment about school closures, and there was a lot of resentment also about masks and other things that made school feel not normal. And that was very effectively weaponized by a network of right-wing organizations that mobilize parents and parents as activists over a lot of culture war issues that were big deals before the pandemic and that come up every single year from I would say from the 1800s onward, but they just change a little bit, right? But I mean, the stuff about, gay teachers and our groomers, that's like straight out of Phyllis Schlafly, like 1971, right? Yeah. Right. And, they're teaching your kids something that, Jesus or the Bible doesn't say. That's a very old playbook. So it's been a juggernaut of very effective appeals. And I do think it's influenced elections. You do hear from focus groups and you hear in polls that people still like their local public schools. They still trust their local public school teachers. They think they're doing the best that they can, but they trust the Democrats less on public education. And they're more likely to, in certain races, of course, you could point to Youngkin in Virginia as an example of this. Interestingly, I think it goes under discussed that also too, states like Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, Republican governors passed pay increases for teachers in the wake of the pandemic. So that's another way that they picked up the mantle of education leaders. So is that going to be the main issue people vote on in the midterms? Probably not, but there might be a contingent. I mean, people worried about certain like demographics of voters, right? So this is like suburban white moms is who you worry about. They might swing a certain direction because of this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it sort of cemented the divisions that have already been there, right? And definitely what we saw here is a certain demographic who probably always had a lot of suspicions and a lot of problems with, and this idea in Chicago that the school system is too geared toward poor students and not as geared towards their children and not as responsive to them. I think that very much came up, that it very much showed how we were one school district with, how we were two school districts within one, and very divided. But yeah, and in the suburbs, you definitely see that people who've probably had these thoughts and feelings for a long time are now empowered, and they're speaking up, quite a lot. And it's going to be interesting to see how the vote, because I think in some ways maybe the abortion debate has sort of neutralized some of these things. Maybe, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see.
Sort of surpassed it in salience, you mean?
Yeah, I think like when you talk about the suburban moms, I mean, I think that some of them might say, well, yeah, I mean, and actually we hear so much more. I mean, at least in Illinois, we're hearing a lot more about abortion than we're hearing about any of these internal debates. I mean, I listen to NPR, and then in other places, it sounds like a lot of these debates are much more, part of the system. But here it's basically either who's more pro-abortion or who's more anti-abortion is really what we're hearing about all candidates at all moments.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Yes, so much going on, right?
Yeah.
I guess probably one of the final questions I wanted to ask is just about, the whole idea of urban school districts losing so many kids. Do you think that there's any way that this could be a positive?
Well, I mean, there's
not
nothing
for the kids that are lost, but more so for the kids that are in the system. I don't think it's good for the kid that dropped out. Probably, no way.
I mean, look, we hear a lot about class size. There have been mixed results of having a small schools movement, and whether it's better, small schools more intimate, there's more, ability for relationships to grow. I think a school district can thrive at any size. The trick is thriving in a decline, right? Because of the way that we do funding and planning and operations. So that is going to be, a major thing to manage through. I think that there are districts that probably have gone through it and have reconstituted at a lower level and are still doing great. But maintaining that sense of mission and saying we're gonna serve the kids that we do have really, really well is something that, and honestly, there are these funding formulas that penalize schools for student headcount. So how are we going to figure out how to fairly fund schools that are losing students, theoretically from no fault of their own? And then the dream of the previous decade, would be that you would create schools that are so enticing that it pulls parents back who have other choices, who want to reinvest in their public schools. So an interesting dynamic that I'm seeing here in New York City is, yes, we've lost students and we're projected to lose more, but there's a certain percentage there's certain demographic of parents that are like, ooh, now I can get into that super enticing school that was like so cutthroat to get into before, and I'm actually excited to get into that school. So I'm going to choose public schools again because of that. So, I mean, the magic form, according to the Century Foundation, some of the best research that I've seen on how do you have integrated, thriving public schools, some of the best ways to do that is to create school models that are things like, language immersion programs or specialized magnet schools that have the ability to pull in different kinds of kids and combine and mix them all together in a way that is beneficial to everyone. So a little bit of inventiveness, maybe we can, maybe some districts can pull it together.
Yeah, and I think that in Chicago they've definitely tried to do magnet, more and more magnet schools. But the problem is in the past, they just really haven't funded it. They've like,
Yeah.
you're a magnet school, and the ones that thrive are the ones who have parents who can raise money to support that magnet school in a way. And so there's even a magnet schools, there's a lot of disparity here. So
Right.
It's going to be an interesting thing. I mean, I'm right now tonight I have to finish a story that is about the fact that Chicago Public Schools has increased its head count by about 4,000 over the last 2 years. So with COVID relief money, but we've lost over that time, about 8,000 this year and about 9,000 last year. So a good number of students. I think the question is, can we use that money and use that staffing to create schools that parents really want to send their kids to? And I don't know. I think it's a challenge, right?
Yeah. But it's the challenge, right? That's what we want our schools to be able to do.
Yeah. And it's interesting, how we've received a lot of migrant children from Texas, and the schools here are like, hallelujah, bring them out. They're glad to have it. They're glad that, one school got 50 kids, and they're like, yeah, that's great. But the problem is that other places might not support them as much. So
I mean, that's America, right? Like we need more people. That's totally a thing. We have a lower declining birth rate, and yeah, our strength has always been newcomers. So I agree with you. Bring it on.
For sure.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple questions from the audience. Maybe we can prime the pump a little bit, Lonnie.
Yeah, I have. So I realize neither one of you are psychologists or mental health providers, but perhaps in your reporting, perhaps you might be able to answer the question that Julie has posted. She says, what advice do you have for parents to help teens who have come through this pandemic to help their social emotional growth? Understanding it's professional wheelhouse, but perhaps in your reporting, some stuff.
This is one of the most common questions I've been getting. And it's so interesting because I think that it shows the shift in focus from, just numbers on a test score to our whole child. And I think many of us are not so used to having to kind of oversee our children's social and emotional development once they get past the preschool age. And the trick is that you really can't. I mean, you can't make a teen do anything they don't want to do. But just what I've come to as a parent, as well as the experts that I've talked with, to say that there are things that your kid loves that really come alive doing that makes them really happy. And you can try to figure out ways to give them more of that. So we don't want to overload our kids with activities and kind of like work on, there's FOMO from the past few years, but if there are any ways to give them opportunities to kind of thrive socially and emotionally, and I want to encourage, depending on what your teenager's kind of situation is, some of them might really thrive with younger children in a sort of service capacity where they can feel that sense of leadership. Some of them might want to feel better with older kids where they have a little bit of mentorship. Some of them might do well in a church program or, whatever your religion or philosophy might be, where there's a real sense of a moral code and something that brings people together in a different way. It could be martial arts. There are many different environments that are not just the massive environment of school where a kid can really thrive and stretch socially and emotionally during this tricky time.
Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
I have a teenage son, so I'm asking the same question. So I don't know the answer. I think that, I for one have had to tell his homecoming's coming up and he's a senior, and I'm like, go to homecoming. And I think post-pandemic, he's very used to just staying at home, and he will just stay, he will just, I'm lazy. I don't feel like it. I'd have to get new shoes. I don't feel like going to get the new shoes or whatever it is. And I'm like, no, let's go. You're going to go to this. And I feel like when I push him a little bit, he'll go. And then later he'll say, I'm glad that I did it. So that's no great philosophy, but it's just what I do. So,
please go ahead, Anya.
Just want to build on to that. I mean, we've been doing kind of like joy lists as a family where we're like, we're going to come up with things that we look forward to. So we went camping and we went rock climbing, and now we're going to go like indoor rock climbing and make little quests, make bucket lists, make it a family activity if you can. Like stuff that makes you really happy.
And if it's any consolation, I can tell you as someone who runs, or at least pre-COVID, ran nothing but live in-person events. And then for the last 30 months, did nothing but Zoom events. And now am doing primarily Zoom events with sprinklings of live events. I can tell you that the habituation of easier to stay at home is not confined to teenagers.
That's right. I know, me too. I feel the exact same way.
I mean, it's everything. I mean, it's even like little things like your friends, like there's massive permission to just like, oh, you know what? I don't think I'm going to make it to lunch today. Oh, you know what? I know we were going to go, I'm just not feeling it. And people are, at least now, and I'm not talking about the workforce, that's a completely different conversation, but that feeling of people are giving folks seems to be like a lot of elbow room and a lot of grace to just be like, okay, I hear you, you're not feeling it. Okay, I hear you, you're not feeling it. So there was one more question from Michelle here. Sounds like she's a teacher. And sorry, everyone, I'm a little bit ill, so if I sound a little strange, I'm going to try not to cough. You mentioned the lack of disclosure by districts who don't want to admit the magnitude of the problem. Are test scores, for example, declining reading scores, a measure to use to pressure schools to come up with smart goals to solve the problem? I'm a teacher and yet worry about the accountability for schools to really do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely have seen them used this way skillfully by good district leaders, the scores. It's a very tricky thing to use it to light a fire under the school and not use it to shame the child or make them feel like the child is less than. So, and we know that, these scores are limited. So in their usefulness, the types of tests that we use. So to the extent that there are school-wide goals, I think the test scores belong in there, along with attendance, along with engagement, and other things that are kind of actionable as well.
Sarah, I want to thank you for a great conversation. You're
Thank
delightful. Glad to have you in the fan fold, and we hope to welcome you again sometime soon. And Anya, as always, third time is for sure the charm with you. And we hope, we're just keep writing those books. You're a young woman. We'll keep bringing you forward. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Any last words, Anya, as we end up?
Thank you so much for coming. You can keep up with me on Twitter or on my newsletter, which I send out every month. And Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And it was nice to see you guys, everyone here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.